Thank you everyone for joining us live or listening to this 10th episode of Maté Conversations. I'm joined today by Omar Kassim, who needs no introduction, but I'm going to do an introduction anyways. He's the founder and CEO of Nomod, also famously known to be the founder of JadoPado, among many other things, and being a big influencer and contributor to the startup ecosystem in MENA. Omar, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. There's a lot I want to talk to you about in this 1 hour. But first of all, let's start with what you're doing right now. It seems that there's some trend for all the e-commerce founders to go on afterwards and start payments companies. There's a founder of Tabby and Tamara and you and others. So tell me about that.
So good question. I think so I basically founded Nomod back in late 2019. Woke up one morning and thought, hey, it'd be a good idea to get back on the treadmill, start building a new thing. And the initial idea was, let's build a consumer digital banking play, which very quickly evolved to a B2B banking play. And we just sort of iterated the idea from there. I can't speak to why other e-com founders have sort of moved towards payments businesses. I'm going to take credit for Tabby though. That was originally my idea, and for Sam and I at some point we're going to do it together. And then I said to him, no, I need to go off and build this banking thing. So it's been awesome to see him sort of pick it up and run with it. So Nomod is where I'm sort of been head down focused for the last sort of year and a half, I guess.
And are you guys fully launched and regulated already?
Sure. We're sort of in the throes of doing a bunch of things at the moment. Regulation being one of them. Today we essentially so this idea was, let's build an alternative to a traditional bank, and essentially we essentially decided that we're effectively going to start building what I'm now calling a financial operating system for businesses in emerging markets. And if you're from our industry, we're effectively today a mashup between Square and Brex. So effectively, we're building a mixture of payments and financial services over time. And I think we haven't officially launched as such. We've essentially just had our heads down, just building the product out, and then started acquiring customers. So today the focus has been primarily on acquiring customers in the UAE, but we've essentially we allow signups from anywhere. So we've dealt with customers from probably about 30, 40 different countries today, and just seeing what's working, just continue to iterate and keep going essentially.
You're known for criticizing banks a lot, and why wouldn't you, right? Why wouldn't anyone criticize banks? But was that the reason? Was that the pain behind starting Nomod?
Yeah, I think some of it was. So I think banks over time have done a poor job of sort of genuinely trying to understand their customers and serve their customers. And I think there's significant disruption on the way to how some of them are traditionally operated. I think, for example, if you take the UAE as a single market in the region, we're genuinely overbanked. So even after some industry consolidation, we're probably 46 or 48 banks at the moment. We've got about, when I last counted, 7 or 8 new digital banks that are sort of in the throes of launching or are sort of on the way. But we're yet to find a single bank that either consumers or corporates or even small businesses genuinely love and can turn around and say that here's a brand that I can trust and that I like, and these guys get me, etc. And I think that just doesn't exist. And I think when you've got a space where the individual customers in that space don't genuinely love what the products that are being built for them and sold to them, then I think there's an opportunity. I mean, you can go out and build an alternative. I think luckily probably 4 or 5 years ago, the reg environment didn't support being able to do that. And I think a lot has changed since then, both in the region as well as globally, in terms of being able to build out banks or the things that banks do in an alternative fashion to your traditional big box out there.
And so you said you have the kind of Brex side of the business and the Square side of the business. I'm guessing you're starting off with the Square-like side of the business first, or?
Yep. Yeah. So it's very much so. The key problem that we took a step back and thought, what are all of the. So one, what have people in other regions built, what's working, what's not, what are some of the problems that we could be solving, and something that we kept coming back to. So I had this side project from 2018-ish, mid 2018, where we basically built a little app called Luna Tap that sat on top of Stripe, and then essentially allowed someone to take their Stripe account into the real world. So you could essentially just log in with your Stripe credentials, and then effectively start using your Stripe account for face-to-face payments. And we kept sort of coming back to that idea and thinking that, traditionally to go out and get access to an in-person card relationship, to, for example, to get access to a card terminal, is actually a very painful process. So you go out and there's paperwork to do, there's contracts, and there's lots of sort of convoluted fees and so on and so forth. And we thought that, hey, if you could build something in that space that would allow someone to sign up really fast, and literally within 3 or 4 minutes of pulling down an app, they could essentially start processing card payments. And that's what we've essentially solved for today. So you can essentially pull down Nomod from the App Store or Play Store, sign up within like 2 or 3 minutes and start processing card payments, both in person and a few weeks ago, probably late May, we shipped payment links as well. So you can essentially sort of check out online as well. So we're absolutely doing the Square side of the business first, minus the hardware. So we think that commodity hardware, there's enough sort of hardware out there. And then essentially from there onwards, sort of build out the rest of the financial services.
So a merchant can use their phone essentially for the hardware? Because Square has their own kind of hardware that they use.
Yeah, so the idea is, and I think the space that we've looked to focus on, and I mean, when you look at payments, payments is a massive market, and there's lots of different bits and pieces that are that sort of go into that value chain. And for us, I think we're really focused on sort of the last mile piece. So effectively the point where the customer wants to make a payment to you as the merchant. So effectively the equivalent of, your merchant essentially typically pulling out some sort of hardware and then essentially asking you to tap or swipe or whatever it may be. I think what we realized is that, and this is primarily a trend that's taken place more in emerging markets than anywhere else, is that on the consumer end, you're starting to see, almost all issuance by default, card issuance is effectively taking place from a contactless perspective. And I think over the next 7 or 8 years, we'll probably get to a point where the plastic just goes away, and you've effectively will have some sort of digital token tokenized to the wallet of your choice. And typically that probably end up being something that's sort of, the default on your operating system, so an Apple Pay or Google Pay. And in some regions, it could be things like Paytm and so on. And so that I think is on one side of the market. On the merchant end of the market, there hasn't really been much movement from sort of, this legacy hardware. And we felt that, given the proliferation of devices out there, you can essentially just, why do you need custom hardware? You can essentially pull up your phone, pull down some software, and effectively it becomes your point of sale, and you can essentially start processing a payment on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And generally, you feel that developed markets could move faster in that. But like, for example, when I'm in the US, it's much harder to use Apple Pay versus here in Dubai. You can really use Apple Pay everywhere versus other markets. And you see it in China or other countries where paying with mobile really moved a lot faster than other countries. When it comes to the Brex side of the business, issuing credit cards or providing credit and so on, do you think you can overcome regulation to that and be allowed to do such a thing at any point in the Middle East at least? I know you're focused more on
I think, and again, just going back to what I was saying earlier, I think if you'd asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I probably would have said that it would have probably been much more challenging than it is today. I think from a reg perspective, I think regulators are much more open to incoming new solutions. For example, when I think about Saudi as an example, I think SALMA has been absolutely incredible, and they're probably the standout regulator in the region from my perspective, both from the way that the regulatory frameworks have been put together, as well as just the approach in terms of being able to embrace new ideas and attract new entrants into their ecosystem. So I think the reg piece is definitely solvable. It's not an easy solve, but then again, if you're building something interesting, it's never easy. So I think you need to go out there and do the work and solve it. But I think it's something that you need to solve alongside as you build the business out. And I think when I think about one of the reasons we decided to build our business out this way was that I think it's important to not just. So I had this tweet a while ago where where I think that there've been lots of startups in the region who went after seeking regulatory permission or seeking licensing, and effectively ended up collecting like a bunch of sandbox licenses and didn't really end up building the business. And I mean, you need to build the business, and I think the reg piece will at some point, you need to be aware of it and you need to start solving it, but you're not going to be able to do that on day one, right? I mean, it's just not, no one's going to give you a license and say, hey, little startup, here you go, here's a license, go off and do whatever you want. I mean, that's not going to happen. So I think they both need to happen in tandem. And for me, I think, when I think about a business like Brex and the way that business has evolved from sort of starting with issuance and then going off and doing interesting things like lending, and I mean, they've got a very sort of an interesting suite of products. So they've got a current account product and so on and so forth. I think a lot of that stuff is very much possible. And I think when I think about emerging markets, there's just a massive opportunity in terms of being able to build something that, for businesses. And for me, in my view, I think the sort of the B2B problem is significantly larger than the B2C problem, essentially. So, which hopefully makes it more fun as we sort of go along.
A lot of the fintech companies or startups in the region are, and generally a lot of startups don't build their product out to be kind of built with a really good documentation, really good self-serve manner. And it's more manual and enterprise-like approach. It seems that what you're building with the Nomod is much more self-serve and Stripe or Brex-like in that sense. So how did you go about that? Where are you in that product roadmap? And how do you think it's a consumer as well behavior? Why a lot of the other startups go down the path where they build a more kind of manual approach, enterprise-like approach versus self-serve. I mean, Stripe is now in the region, so which is they're the masters for a self-serve, beautifully done product. And I saw in your product as well, like from having dig into it in detail, but from what I've seen, it has a lot of similarities, aspirations towards some of the global players.
Yeah, look, I think Stripe is definitely a business that we've taken inspiration from, a business that we respect, and I think it's not just the way they've gone about building their business, but just how they've gone out and executed. And I think the attention to detail is probably second to none at this point. And I mean, it shows through and through with sort of all areas of their both their product, their documentation, and their business. I think for me, it's probably it's an approach thing, right? I think we learned a bunch of stuff when we were building when we built products in the consumer space, and I think consumers generally care more about experience than businesses do. But at the same time, when you at the end of the day, a business is made up of a bunch of consumers, right? So when a business when you can provide that sort of great experience, I think it just allows you to stand out versus your competition. And I think, look, for me, what we built today always and will for a while remain a work in progress. I mean, there's if you look at so the way I like to think about startups are there's a nice veneer in front, but in the background it's literally there's a lot of
mess.
I mean it's a complete total mess, and I think sometimes on the outside you don't realize that. I mean, a lot of stuff is broken, a lot of stuff doesn't work. I mean, if I showed you the state of the documentation, there is documentation, there's lots of specs, there's a lot of stuff that's happening, but the reality is that there's always going to be finite resources, right? And I think you need to decide what is your what's your North Star, what's your compass, and what is that pointing towards, and what's important. And there'll always be. So for us, I mean, the priority is ship a great product and keep shipping. And so we will try to do all of the other things, and we'll try to make sure that we're taking the boxes there. But sometimes stuff is broken until you end up fixing it. I think the challenge is that we don't approach it with the mentality of saying that eventually it'll be fixed. I think that it doesn't get fixed, and you sort of. But I think if you just have this approach of saying that, look, there needs to be a high quality bar, and you chase after it. I think it's something that's achievable, and I think it's something that's worth doing in my view.
How do you build that mentality and translate it across the team and people, especially on the tech side, when it comes to maintaining a balance between the perfection kind of mentality and shipping quickly as well? So where is that balance? What's your approach or methodology that you use with with yourself and with your team as well?
Yeah, so I think if you'd asked me a few years ago, my approach was to perfect it and say that, hey, let's make sure that it's absolutely right. Let's make sure that everything is working and that we've sort of dotted every I, crossed every T before we ship it. I think experience has shown that's probably not the right approach. I think you probably need to be a little bit embarrassed by what you're shipping. So I mean, when I go back and look at where we were 6 months ago, 12 months ago in terms of some of the stuff that was coming out the door, I mean, we were lucky in the sense that there weren't like a bunch of people judging us at that time, and I can probably get to why that was. But I think it essentially, I think you need to be a little bit embarrassed by what you're shipping at any given point, and essentially focus on actually getting it out the door. I think it needs to be at a level where it works and it makes sense for the audience that you're putting it in front of. But look, at the end of the day, if you I'd rather ship something, get feedback from the customer, and iterate the product quickly versus taking a long time to perfect it, and then by the time you get it out, you recognize that the market has moved on, or your product is no longer relevant.
Yeah, you don't want to build in isolation, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, exactly.
With customers giving you feedback at the same time. And then speaking of that feedback from especially when you're building a complex tech product, how do you kind of manage that feedback loop with customers as you grow? And you've experienced that with JadoPado as well before and now. So how do you make sure you take feedback, but also you don't get distracted by every single piece of feedback that's coming at you?
Sure. So I think, I mean, yeah. So one of the things that I've personally liked doing is that even today, I still answer the majority of support tickets, and I think it's a great way to be able to understand exactly what your customers are saying, the sort of things that they're asking of you, the things that are missing. I think it's easy to hire someone and throw the problem at them and never think about tickets again, but I think it's one of those things where I think it's a really tight feedback loop. So you ship something, and a couple of days later, someone comes back and says, "Hey, it's broken. This isn't working," or I wish the product could do this. And so I think you take that and you sort of triage it and throw it into your product process, and then basically try to figure out what's important, what isn't, what should you work on, what are the priorities. And for me, I think probably a good way of thinking about that is if you pick a single metric for your business, and if you could just pick, and I think for most businesses that are looking to generate revenue from day one, it probably is revenue or some sort of equivalent metric. And for businesses that aren't, it's probably user growth or something along those lines. And I think you pick that one metric, and then you basically say, okay, what can I do today to essentially move the needle on that metric, right? And I think if you sort of use that sort of single-minded approach and say, okay, when I look at this feature, is it going to move that metric or not? If it's not, then it's probably not a priority today. If it is going to move that metric, so if I iterate the sign-up flow a little bit further, I'll get 5x more signups, which means that I'll be able to drive the revenue metric further. Then yes, we should do that. And I think it's probably a good way to sort of triage and think about what features should come out next. And I think then you need to balance that with some of your strategic objectives. So it can't be all. It probably needs to be like 90% sort of short-term focus, and then 10% you're sort of thinking about. Okay, I'm going to have to build some pieces from a reg perspective. So, for example, we need to be able to make sure that we sort of KYC these customers or KYB these customers, whatever it may be. So that's not going to move the needle from a revenue perspective, but if I don't do that, then the regulator is going to sort of turn around and shut me down. So I think it's just trying to strike a balance between those, essentially.
Yeah, there's been a lot of founders, successful founders who've kind of pioneered the approach of building in public. You're public about a lot of topics. Have you taken the approach of kind of like disclosing more of your metrics? I mean, in the region here, especially in MENA, a lot of founders, we have the culture of keep everything closed, don't share information, and that ends up being not great in a lot of ways because founders can't learn from other founders. So in the West and other markets, you have a lot of founders publicly sharing their numbers and metrics and revenue on their metrics to like a pretty advanced stage. Do you plan to do that? Is that an approach that you take?
It's a great question. Honestly, I'm a little bit on the fence in terms of. I think there are a couple of challenges there, right? One, I think yes. I mean, in the region, people generally have an aversion to sharing numbers. I personally have no issues with sharing numbers. I'm happy to talk about numbers and tell you about over the last 3 weeks we grew 30% week on week on average. So which is great, but I think. So I think there's two challenges. One, I think when you look at founders who are, and typically you're seeing a lot of solo founders and sort of solo teams today who tend to be self-funded and who are essentially going out and effectively building their next project that may turn into a product. And they're at that point there typically isn't. There isn't a focus on fundraising. There isn't a focus on going out and talking to. They're typically, you're just out there shipping, and you could be doing, and I've seen a bunch of people sort of they're doing live streams on YouTube. They're doing streaming on Twitch and so on and so forth, and actively sharing the metrics on places like Twitter, etc. Which I think is a great approach when you're in that frame of mind. I think the challenge is that when you're out there building something. And I mean, when you sort of look at a funded startup today, one of the challenges that when you're out there raising capital, the way the venture ecosystem works, and some of the nuances within that, having all of your data out there probably isn't a good thing because there's elements of FOMO, there's elements of needing to create the right.
A lot of worries.
There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of, and I think over time you learn the nuance that's within that space, and so I think while theoretically it feels like a good idea to be sharing everything out there, I think the reality is it probably end up doing yourself a disservice, and I think maybe there's a balance to be struck by. So I think. One of the businesses that I'm a big admirer of and have been for a few years now is a business called GitLab. And so GitLab is essentially an open source competitor to GitHub, and GitLab has become infamous, or sort of I guess sort of they've reached some relative amount of fame again in the industry because they currently now are 1,000-person team spread out across like 60 locations globally, and they're completely remote. They've never had any offices. The only office that they've had actually is the founder has access to a boardroom, which if I remember right, used to be like located like right next to his apartment, or his apartment was part of the boardroom. There was some craziness there. But effectively, I think one of the things that they did was that they anything that you want to know about GitLab's business and how they run it. So they have this incredible handbook that they've been writing over, say, almost since the business started, and down to like the minutia of. The detail in there is just absolutely incredible, and the reason that they've done that is that by having all of that information out there publicly, one, it acts as a great hiring tool to be able to bring people in who like that culture, and at the same time, it just means that they for their team they can run everything in a relatively public fashion. So, for example, their internal meetings are streamed on YouTube, etc. But GitLab does not publish its financials. There are a key set of metrics that you will not find in the handbook simply because, again, now GitLab, I think if I remember right, is probably looking to IPO in the next 2 to 3 years. So you can't, you really can't sort of be out there publishing every metric. But some things, yeah. So I think if I just conclude on this way, I think if you strike a right balance, I think there's a lot that you can share and that you probably should share, and there are probably something that you should probably keep to yourself.
Yeah, there are advantages. That one of two of the startups that have done this well and really benefited from, there's one called Copy.ai, and they're just from day one, their founder and everyone is brought on board. Like the way they've done it is that by sharing, they allowed like the community they've built around them to celebrate their wins. And he ended up hiring people from Twitter, a lot of people from that community. So yeah, there's a lot of ConvertKit is another one which became like quite big and still share a lot of like the details on how they're doing. What are some of the kind of like growth? I mean, the space that you're in is getting more and more competitive locally and globally. Like you said, it's pretty big and there's still a lot of problems to solve. How do you compete, and what kind of like growth hacks and approach? I know you're product-led kind of business, but what kind of like growth and marketing tactics or hacks or things you've done to win customers?
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, there hasn't been a whole lot yet. We've literally put our heads down and just have been focused on building the product. And I think one of the things that I explicitly decided not to do that I'd done previously was I decided not to do any PR. I decided not to talk much about Nomod. I stopped tweeting as much as I used to. And just basically decided that, look, let's just build the product and just keep talking to customers, acquiring customers, iterate it, and effectively see what happens. And so we've not ended up officially launching the business. We've not really done much in that space, but we've got more than 1,000 customers sign up today. And as I was saying earlier, we're growing. Last 3 weeks, we've grown 30% week on week on average. And so I think things seem like they're headed in the right direction. But look, I think it was just for me, it was essentially saying, hey, maybe we should take a slightly different approach this time and just be really, really sort of focused on the product. I think COVID is also, while it's been a difficult time, given everything that's been happening around us, I think it's also provided like no events, apologies to you guys, but no face-to-face meetings. And it's literally just been sitting down day in, day out and saying, okay, keep yourself motivated and just keep focusing on building. And so I think it's been incredibly like a focused time essentially for me, and hopefully COVID goes away, but hopefully we can continue in the same stead.
That's amazing. Have you been bootstrapped from the beginning till now, and do you have plans to fundraise?
No, not really. To be honest, I put some money into the business myself. We've already raised a fair amount of capital, most of it from angel investors in the region. We closed some money from a VC recently, and yeah, I think there's we're continuing to have conversations in that space, and I think just given the current environment, I think there's a lot of interest in what we're building, and I think there's just a lot of capital out there that's looking for a home. So yeah, I think we'll continue to raise capital as we go.
That's amazing. You really haven't been doing PR on this stuff, yes?
I think we will at some point, but I think it's just been just focus on the business for the moment.
I agree. I think there's not many startups and founders that are very like product led and product focused, and in general, like I think we need to up our game in the region, specifically in terms of building world-class products. That's why you don't see SaaS companies coming out of the region here and becoming global, or even fintech companies becoming global from the region. Mostly you see regional focused companies that are copycats. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in building local to global stuff. Anyway, we'll get to that stuff in a bit. I want to actually talk a little bit about JadoPado and the story there. And this was a whole different time when JadoPado was around, and the ecosystem looked very different. Everything looked very different. So what were some of the, looking back for you right now at some of the pain points and challenges you had at that time compared to now? What have you learned from these? Do you think you still face these challenges today if you had thought about it?
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, great question. I'll try to remember whatever I can. It feels like it was such a long time ago, but I think to an extent, look, the ecosystem has moved along tremendously since then. But at the same time, I think some of there are still some fundamental problems that continue to exist, and I think for example, things like I think there's still capital from the region tends to not always find a home in the region, and I think you still find that there's a bunch of so I think there's a lot of capital in the region, but a lot of it still ends up with being invested in startups outside of the region. It's changing in that you've got a bunch of sovereign wealth funds, guys like Nomod, etc., who've now got MENA specific vehicles. Literally, I think if I remember right, my mother's vehicle is less than a year old, and so they've gone from sort of being very externally focused to now being internally focused. So I think some of them are being solved, but then you've got structural issues and so on and so forth. But without getting into the problems, I think look, JadoPado was a great time. It was an interesting time, but lots of lessons learned. But here we are a few years later, I guess.
So what are the things that you'd say are somehow solved, and other things that, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to capital, to other things, in general, just what are the things that you think there's been a lot of improvement in, and things that still need a lot of work?
Sure. So I think if I just maybe start at a point where when we started JadoPado, Kareem didn't exist. No significant. I mean, Maktub had, if people remember Maktub had exited a few years prior, but Suk had started a few years before us. But I mean, the ecosystem was so nascent that even saying to a consumer that, hey, come in and shop online was a new thing, and today. That fundamental problem of being able to say, I mean, by and large, I think there's a significant portion of consumers that are just digital by default at the moment, and that was never the case. Think back to a time where you used to ring up a restaurant and order food. I mean, I can't remember a time, and when you ask most people, they can't remember a time when that used to happen, but it did. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, and similarly, I mean, over COVID. There've been players that I thought would never get their act together from an e-com perspective, suddenly in the space of a few months and in some cases in the space of a few weeks managed to put it together, and it just became a point where if you didn't, your business was effectively going to be dramatically affected. And so I think that fundamental sort of chicken and egg problem has been solved in the sense that now we've got consumers that are digital by default. There's a general embracing of digital as a valid channel, and in a lot of cases as a more convenient channel. And then I think on the other side of the equation, I think you've now got a lot of the infrastructure that you need in terms of whether that be logistics or whether that be things like fulfillment. Whether for restaurants, whether it be things like dark kitchens or dark stores and so on and so forth. If I just talk about sort of e-com or e-commerce in general, again, none of that stuff existed. People didn't know how to run warehouses for sort of single item picking. People were used to running warehouses for retail operations, which tend to be very different. So it's you break down bulk and then you deliver in bulk to a retail store. That doesn't work for e-commerce, and so I think a lot of that stuff has been solved in my view.
So the biggest challenge you would say, something to improve on is which we're starting to see improvement on, is the capital invested locally versus globally.
Yeah, I think look, capital is one of those things that, I mean, look, it's an enabling piece, right, of the ecosystem, and I think alongside that, I think we are going to continue to need more talent in the space. We continue to need more people that understand tech and product and are able to build the sort of experiences that we need to build in the region for the region. So there's still a lot of product that is that is essentially targeted at consumers in the region that hasn't actually been built in the region. So there's lots of startups out there who have engineering functions that are in the subcontinent or in some cases in Germany or in the UK or wherever else. And so I think a lot of that stuff isn't happening in the region. So sometimes that nuance of what you want to build for the region gets lost, and so you end up building generic products. But yeah, I think it's I'm sure that there are sort of other things out there, but it's probably those two for me. I mean, being able to really understand the region from a product perspective, being able to invest capital in for the region's products.
Is the time? I mean, everyone talks about, when they talk about talent, they say, in Dubai you can just import talent from whatever talent you need, you can import. Do you think that talent is missing on the top, on the founder level, or on the staff that you need to hire?
I think you're going to get me to trouble.
You can't import founders, right? I mean, you can.
But look, I think, I mean, look, I've always felt that we don't have enough high quality startups, and I think that's probably a function of not enough So I think, and I think that's probably a function of not having enough product-focused founders, as well as by extension, and this is probably the biggest gap, we don't have enough technical founders in the region. So, and I think that there's probably, again, another function of not having enough engineering talent in the region. And so to find a founder that genuinely is understands product, can potentially build a business, and has can read code at the same time is like a super rare combination. And so I think we need a lot more of that, and I think it'll probably take a while to get there. And just speaking to the talent piece, I think the old model was, let's import all of the talent in. I think a lot of the talent today is probably turning around and saying, hey, I'm super happy to work remote, but unless there's a desperate need for me to fly out somewhere and sort of come out to your offices on a day in, day out basis, it probably doesn't make sense today. I think a lot of the good talent or a lot of the great talent can probably be accessed in a more remote function versus importing it in. And I think that's definitely, and so I think if anything, we probably need to change the way we build our organizations. I'm probably biased in this, but I think, one of the things that I think we need to learn better in the region is how to build remote organizations and how to run and manage remote organizations, versus the traditional organizations that we've been used to, and sort of the more traditional modes of management in terms of, hey, everyone turn up to this office space, and how many hours have you been here for, and versus sort of becoming more output oriented essentially.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, and I think that talent is missing on both sides. So on the founder side as well, and how can we generate better founders? And because that's what will lead essentially to go back to that capital conversation, the massive capital to be invested in the region. We need to get to a stage where you see a good number of founders from the region going and moving their startups to the US, and then raising massive capital there and raising the reputation here in the region. Like, Stripe, for example, had to move out initially. Also, a lot of companies from Israel, for example, or other countries. So,
sure.
But yeah, the technical talent is that's a big one to solve, and I think there's a massive effort that needs.
Yeah, and I think if I don't want to toot the UAE's horn too much, but I think if you look at some of the things that the UAE is starting to do now in terms of sort of addressing the structural issues of having individuals in the economy that are going to stay here on a more permanent basis, with sort of long-term residency options, and eventually potentially handing out citizenship and so on and so forth. I think the reality is that it's those structural problems that are sometimes preventing that nurturing of talent. I don't think it's an issue of sort of capability or access to to education, or even access to capital to enable those pieces to happen. I mean you look at an ecosystem like Israel as an example. I mean, it was a need to sort of build the tech ecosystem out, and so they did it. I mean, they went out and they. And I mean, and honestly speaking, it's an incredible ecosystem that has contributed so significantly back into places like Europe and the States in terms of. I mean, there's so many Israeli founders who sort of moved out as well and sort of built significant businesses in other parts of the world. So I think it's not something that we can't do. I think it's just if we can get the structural pieces right, I think it's definitely possible.
Yeah, I agree. And the UAE specifically is built in a way where we're surrounded by countries with amazing technical talent. So India, Russia, Pakistan, Egypt, Jordan. So the question is, a lot of these talent, technical talent specifically, when they go to the US, immigrate to the US and live there for a few years and get the other kind of skill sets, they do like outstanding things. So how that's the question I was kind of like wonder about. So how to attract this kind of talent and nurture them within the UAE to then go on and do amazing stuff. I want to ask you about the famous, was it 16 days or 17 days at noon before you call it quits? So how did that happen? Also, I don't know how much you want to talk about the acquisition, but It would be good
Sure.
to
So yeah, I mean, look, I don't think we ended up sharing the numbers about the acquisition, but I think the acquisition itself was. So we saw Amazon coming into the region, and I think it was pretty clear that at some point they were gonna pull the trigger on. I mean, it wasn't explicitly clear, but at some point it became clear that they were going to pull the trigger on the Sui transaction, and so that happened. And I think when we saw that Noon was going to happen, I think it was pretty clear to me at the time that that there was a short window in terms of being able to figure out either that we were going to go out and be able to raise significant capital, or alternatively that we should look to exit the business at that time. And I think the reality around capital at the time was that Sui had pretty much cornered all of the capital that was willing to invest in the region. So, there was little to no, so for example, JadoPado started before Beko Capital started. I mean, we've, the VC ecosystem was just so nascent at the time. They had, not very many dollars available to invest. And I think, the couple of investors that had taken a gamble on the region were Naspers or Process today, and essentially Target Global, and they were both in Souk's cap table. And so there was essentially no one else that we were able to talk to that essentially what we're thinking that MENA sort of e-commerce in MENA could turn into something meaningful. And so I think it became pretty clear that we should consider exiting the business. We actually had a few options at the time. We were talking to a few people at the time. And then we pulled the trigger on Noon, and yeah, unfortunately, it didn't quite work out the way we thought it would. I think I learned had a crash course in acquisitions and how they potentially should be managed over like a 2-week period. But yeah, I mean, it was an interesting experience if not anything.
Before I ask you what happened during that time at Noon, so were you sold or bought? Did you go out and reach out to Noon or
look? We had been in a conversation with Noon prior. We re-engaged that conversation. I mean, it was something that I felt needed to happen, and I think there were some investors and potentially a few people that disagreed with me at the time. But when I think back on it now, I think people forget that pretty much there's maybe one player that's significant that has survived from that time. Pretty much every other player, and some players who raised tens of millions of dollars, who effectively ended up collapsing.
And the only or others, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a list. I mean, there's Market VIP, there was Wadi, there were AWOC, there was a bunch of players, and across different categories, across different verticals, who effectively did not end up surviving because essentially, and what was clear to me was that, the capital that Noon was going to bring to market, whether it was all available or not at the time, was essentially just going to be so distortive that it was going to make it extremely difficult for someone to survive without having a significant war chest on hand. And so I think in sort of the general marketplace category, it was clear to me that it was going to become a 2-horse race. It was probably going to be Amazon and Noon. And hence, to me, it was, given that Noon had struggled to get off the ground themselves, in terms of version 1 of their product, I was like, great, this feels like the right opportunity for us. It's not that I wanted to sell the business. I would have loved to continue to build it, but strategically, I think sometimes, you just need to know when to take a call, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good analysis, I think, of that. And then during the time, I mean, we all remember, for whoever lived during that period in Dubai, remembers, all the stories and the rumors and the different things coming out of Noon during that early days at Noon. Why did you quit so quickly?
Sure. So I think, yeah, good question. I think there was just a cultural mismatch in terms of what the business was looking to do from an external perspective, and what they wanted to do from an external perspective versus the reality inside the business. I mean, I think a lot of that stuff has been solved down, has been fixed. And so kudos to to the team that sort of went on and did that. I think to me, I think we just and given that we had a fundamental difference in how a business should be run and sort of what it meant to be sort of building a startup and how you should essentially manage your team and so on and so forth. I think I just decided that, look, I've got other things that I could potentially, and I was lucky in the sense that I had options, right? So I decided that, hey, let's pull the plug. I can go off and do something else.
Did you work directly with Al-Abbar?
I didn't actually. No, I've met him previously. I was working with the team at Noon or the new team at Noon that was coming in. There were elements of the team at MR that were also sort of helping out at the time. I think Al-Abbar was and pretty much remains sort of in a chairman role for the business essentially.
Yeah, but he's also, from what I know, heavily involved in the details of the business. What do you think overall of it's Noon is not really a startup. It's a partly a startup, but it's a successful venture, and what they've built today, taking big market share. What do you think of the execution? Not at that time, but looking at it now.
Sure. So I think I think I don't mean any discredit to the larger team at Noon, but I think without the current CEO for us, as well as the de facto CTO Hisham, who are both ex-Namshi and effectively built together with Hisham, built Namshi out from scratch. I don't think Noon would have gotten to the point where it is today, simply because I think there's an extremely short list of individuals in the region that can balance building the sort of business that they've built out and knowing how to build it out, and then sort of also on the other side managing some of the let's just politely call it political fallout that sort of comes with being in a business that way. And look, when I look back on it, they've definitely built an interesting business. I think it depends on how or what you use to measure success by, but from an execution perspective, they've definitely executed well. The product has by and large executed and has iterated well. Things like Nana have been, in my understanding, have been wildly successful essentially. That business on its own could stand alone and effectively be a significant startup by itself. So I think there has generally been good execution out there. But at the same time, on the other side, my understanding is that from someone that I know pretty well, Amazon currently is spending I'd say sort of in the low hundreds of millions of dollars, or they're burning in the low hundreds of millions of dollars to keep the MENA operation up and running. Given that Noon is competing against that, I wouldn't be surprised to hear if they're burning similar amounts of cash at this point. I don't specifically know, but I think it's probably a while to go in terms of before this sort of this rivalry sort of plays out and we see who's still left standing essentially.
So the whole industry is just burning cash right now, basically.
Yeah. Look, it's known. I think people have known that e-commerce and especially sort of general goods marketplaces will take a lot doing, and I think Amazon's been lucky in that. I shouldn't say lucky, but they have other businesses that they can use to, and obviously Amazon being global, they've got a lot of other regions that they can sort of use to offset the cash that they're burning in this region and such. But I think, and then on the other side, sort of Noon's got PIF on one side, and then sort of Abu Dhabi on the other. So there's also a lot of cash there. So I think it'll be interesting to see who sort of survives and what sort of ends up happening. I guess probably in the next 3 or 4 years, essentially.
You followed the AWOC story in details, and I think you did a Clubhouse session on it or something. And what do you think what do you think the fate of all the vertical focused e-commerce startups that are in the region? How do such founders, what actions or kind of things they should follow to avoid bankruptcy, essentially?
Yeah, I think, look, it's, I think the challenge that, so I think, a number of, I think pretty much every player had slightly different problems. excuse me, in the sense that AWOC had, my understanding is they had a bunch of issues with their investors. I think they had the right model, but just couldn't follow through in terms of the capital that was required to continue to build their business out. I think in terms of I think the challenge probably from an e-com perspective today, if you're sort of vertically focused, like for example, if I think about a business like Mum's World today, probably out of left field, they had First Cry come in from India, and essentially First Cry's raised a significant amount of capital, low hundreds of millions of dollars, 400 million if I remember right, from SoftBank. Really understands operations well. The product is, product probably middle of the ground. It does its job. I don't think it's outstanding yet. But they came in and they basically carved out significant amount of share for themselves. And so I think that the challenge is that, I'd probably think about which battles to pick. So I think it's difficult to, without having the right amount of capital in your cap table or having the ability to raise that, to go out and solve every single problem that needs to be solved. So for example, if you're building a product and engineering, and then you're essentially building a product from scratch, and then you're building warehousing and you're building logistics and you own inventory, I think there's a lot of problems that you're trying to solve right at the same time. I mean, today when I think one of the interesting things has been there've been a few D2C startups in the e-com space who I think have literally just sat on top of Shopify and said, okay, I'm only going to solve brand, supply chain, and let Shopify do all of the heavy lifting in terms of the actual e-com journey. I don't want to think about all of those pieces. It's already been solved. So I think it's not obviously not solvable in every model out there, but I think you probably need to pick your battles. And there's nothing stopping you from iterating, right? I think I'd say, okay, go to market with something that you think will work, and just iterate your approach. I mean, when we started, we were a direct e-com player. We had warehousing, we had a fleet. We were doing same day deliveries at sort of early 2011 with inventory in warehouse. Essentially, we attempted grocery. Grocery was actually the first thing that we attempted. I remember these listings of Pepsi, and we had a relationship with a large cash and carry business. We shared a warehouse with them for 6 months, attempted to do grocery, and it just wouldn't work. And so kept iterating, and eventually got to a point, like 5.5, 6 years later, where we'd thrown everything else out and we were purely a marketplace platform. So I think you just need to figure out and just sort of go with the market and sort of go out and build something that at the end of the day, build that's going to work.
From what you've seen, what are if a founder wants to start something in the e-commerce space today? From what I've seen so far, for example, everything that's like very low cost, like cheap product at scale. We've seen AWOC, Bulkwiz, similar companies. No one was able to crack that. It seems to be like almost impossible to sustain a business with that, even if you had the capital, because some of these they did have, like maybe they needed more, but they did have good backing essentially. So is the better approach to focus on a niche or like you said, solving a specific problem?
Yeah, look, I honestly haven't kept enough of an eye on the e-com space to sort of specifically comment on what I think will.
Yeah, from what you've seen,
but yeah, I mean, look, I think it's for me, general marketplaces is probably done, and unless you have like a great take on it, I think there's probably going to be a difficult space to start up. And when I think about so Bulkwiz was sort of more leaning towards bulk grocery, but when I think about AWOC's business today, I think there's significant competition from lots of players out of China. So whether you look at someone like Jolly Chic or Shein or there's effectively a bunch out there, and they're effectively sitting right next to the supply chain. So they're I wouldn't say as close as, but almost co-located with where the factories are, etc. And so I think unless you've got a great model there, again, I think that's probably going to be difficult to beat. Shipping out of China isn't a significant deal. The last mile also is a solvable problem. So I think that probably again is a space that I probably wouldn't look at. I think D2C remains interesting. I think there's a lot of potential in building brands for the region. I don't think we've got I think we've seen it in sort of adjacent spaces. For example, in the UAE, we've seen a lot of food-related startups. I think we have a significant economy around people liking to eat out, especially at independent brands. Drink lots of hipster coffee, and so on and so forth. So I think that there's potentially some spaces there.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I've seen also clothing brand. Like I can't remember the name, but like yoga pant, like from the UAE, and they're pretty global.
Sure. So for example, there's guys like the Giving Movement.
That's the one. That's the one.
So my brother runs a fulfillment business called Fafil. Quick plug to him. So they currently so the Giving Movement is a significant customer for them today. So I think they're probably a really good example of someone who's just basically built a D2C business from scratch from the region, and now is looking to expand out from the region into places like the UK and the US and so on and so forth. I've seen, for example, platforms for independent fashion designers. I think there's a lot that you can potentially get out there and do, but I think you need to probably pick something where you have a competitive advantage, and something that probably works in the region versus something that could be served from outside.
I agree. Yeah, I think DTC is definitely underrated. I mean, Huda Beauty is massive conglomerate out of that. We have a few minutes left, so I want to go back to Nomod, and so if a step or startup or a company want to use Nomod today, is your product available to start using it today? And across
absolutely. It's literally nomod.com, so nomod.com. You can pull down either the apps either from the Play Store or App Store, and essentially sign up in a few minutes, start accepting card payments. We settle directly to merchants today ourselves, you can. It's just a super easy way for a business that wants to be able to accept payments really fast.
And that's for customers who are in the UAE or which countries are you?
We personally are focused on acquiring customers and serving customers in the UAE, but we've got businesses in a bunch of places today. We've seen customers from places like Aruba, the States, India, Pakistan, Nigeria. There's lots and lots of markets out there that we're happy to serve today. And I think for us, it's basically keeping the door open, seeing what markets work, and then essentially and then potentially going out and serving those markets. I think in the short term, the plan is to from the UAE to expand out into MENA, and then look at sort of adjacent emerging markets beyond that. But I mean, you never know, right? I mean, maybe a market starts taking off for us, and we change the plan and we go out and start serving that market a little bit better.
So is that just the physical card product today, or can I also set up Nomod as a payment gateway on my website?
No, so I don't think so we don't have any immediate plans to turn into an acquirer or a processor ourselves. I think there's lots of guys out there, and I'd very readily point everyone towards Stripe and say that, look, Stripe will do that best for you. You should just sign up with them. And I think, look, I'm not someone who was a fan of sort of reinventing or sort of rebuilding the same thing over. I think Stripe's done a great job, and they probably will continue to do so in that infrastructure space. I'd probably just go with them. I mean, we have a really strong working relationship with Stripe ourselves. So I'd go out and sort of look at someone like that.
It's very true. And what is next so what's your kind of product roadmap look like? What other products do you have in the roadmap?
Sure. So I think we're looking to. I think that there's a few bits that we're working on. So one obviously the current features that we've got out there, we're continuing to iterate them. So I think in the short term, we want to start supporting teams. So a business can essentially come in and start adding various individuals in their organization. So if you for example think about a delivery business or anyone who's got sort of multiple stores and so on and so forth. So we want to be able to serve those businesses a little bit better. And then beyond that, we're looking at the equivalent of doing a current account. We're going to do corporate cards at some point, and I think we're really trying to get ourselves to a place where we can start lending to our merchants. And I think we're probably not quite there yet, but I think that's sort of the holy grail in our business, essentially get to a bunch of different financial services, and hopefully we've essentially built an alternative to to what a typical bank does today, and hopefully none of these merchants need to turn around and ever talk to a bank again in the future. So
yeah, corporate cards are a big issue. I mean, today I think if you get a corporate card under your business in the UAE, you don't get any benefits such as miles or any of that.
Sure.
So a lot of people have it under personal names, and then you have to do all the accounting that comes with that.
Yeah.
What do you think of Zen, the new digital bank? Is that's run also by Alaba?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch out there at the moment. So Zen, from my understanding, they've basically been building this business since mid 2017, and they've raised a fair bit of capital as well, and I think it's taken them a while to get to to solve the Reg 3 piece. I think the tech stack has been rebuilt a couple of times, is my understanding. But I think, look, I'd love to sort of see and understand the business a bit better before sort of concretely commenting on it. I think, look, yeah, I mean, there's 7 or 8 plays at the moment, serious plays at the moment. I probably should do a thread on them at some point, but yeah, I think it's good to see, but I think the proof is in the pudding, right? I don't think anyone has executed a great B2B play yet. I think Live, from at least a UAE sort of consumer perspective, was probably a good was a good start. I think then they ran into some sort of traditional banking issues when they started trading their pricing and so forth. And the last I saw, the individual that built that business has basically left to go off and build a new digital bank with ADQ in Abu Dhabi. So yeah, I think lots of sort of quiet movement in the space, and hopefully we'll see some interesting stuff sort of coming out the door.
Yeah, it makes sense also to start on B2B and then shift to B2C after that. We're almost out of time. My dogs started barking as well. Not if I'm about the time. This has been really great. I could go on for hours. Hope to have you back again on the show and see where Nomod is at and discuss more things. Thank you for being on.
Thanks a lot, Ray. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time as well.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you like this podcast and want to listen to more episodes, subscribe to the Maté Conversations podcast on one of your favorite podcast channels.